Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the first half of a two-part set of episodes that are frankly overdue. For those of you who have watched our primer series, you might have noticed one name turning up time and time again. A certain prolific firearms inventor who hardly needs an introduction. And yet, we are constantly having to reintroduce you to Mr. John Moses Browning, all thanks to his deep influence on the modern firearm. Well, instead of just cramming a miniature biography into each episode, and especially having to clean up some older primers that were released before the introduction of Mr. Gorenstein's excellent and very up-to-date, mind you, book, I highly recommend reading this if you have any curiosity about Browning beyond a simple video online. Instead of readdressing everything, I think it's best to finally get a cursory rundown of Browning's life and inventions in one place. This is going to be a little fast-paced, though, as you can tell by the runtime, it's still going to take a while for us to get there. The man was very busy. It's almost going to follow the filing dates on his US patents, though some exceptions will be made, to keep the story roughly in order. We could do a whole breakdown of the original dates for every scrap of paper that we can find, but frankly by that point I'd be rewriting the book, so let's just do the best we can on a reasonable schedule. Before we get rolling, however, let's be clear of one thing. If you own any of the pieces I'm about to mention, it's always best to keep these treasures preserved with a thin, lustrous coat of Ballistol. Now, I promised that anybody that took a picture with the big can would get an appearance on the show. Rod was the first to take us up on the offer, so now we all get to bask in his 1-gallon glory. Thank you, sir. Get your own, or perhaps something more manageable, and make sure to tell them that we sent you. Now, the story of John Moses Browning starts with his father, Jonathan Browning. Born in Tennessee 1805, he began his education as a blacksmith but switched thanks to an apprenticeship under Nashville gunsmith Samuel Porter. At age 21, he married his first wife, Elizabeth Stalcup. Over time, Jonathan and his family would move to Quincy, Illinois, then out to the village of La Prairie. Around this time, he met Joseph Smith, founder and leader of the Church of Latter-day Saints, publisher of the Book of Mormon, who at the time had established a town known as Nauvoo. His movement, however, was unpopular with many, due to their practice of polygamy, with one man being permitted to keep multiple wives. Browning converted to the new faith and moved his family and gun shop to Nauvoo. Following the murder of Joseph Smith, Browning and his family remained with the Mormons as they traveled further west, spending time in Iowa, then settling in Ogden, Utah. In 1854, he took a second wife, Elizabeth C. Clark, and the first of the children born with her was our John Moses Browning today. Native to Ogden, John Moses was born January 23rd of 1855. His father was by this time already 49 years old. The children from his first wife were all grown and frankly unimpressed with his new religion. This made Browning something of an eldest child to all those who would follow, and there were plenty. For the sake of brevity, however, let's pick out the two that will remain in our story. Father's third wife, Anne Emmett, was wed in 1858, and in January of 1859 birthed Jonathan Edmund Browning, who generally went by Ed, which is far less confusing. Returning to his second wife, Elizabeth, in October of that same year, she would give birth to Matthew Sandifer Browning. All these three boys, along with some other scattered children, were raised in the frontier town of Ogden, Utah, helping their father tend his hastily built and fairly crude blacksmith/gunsmithing shop. Most importantly, though, he had brought along some necessary tools like his anvil, bellows, and a foot-driven lathe. By age 6, John Moses was being taught to pick out appropriate scrap metal for forging and hammering into parts. At age 10, he made his first firearm, a simple shotgun cut from a damaged barrel and ignited with burning cord, hand-placed by his brother's assistants. While the boys managed to take 3 grouse in one shot, his father chided John Moses for having made such a shoddy bit of workmanship. Young John Moses scrapped the gun, determined to do better. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed with a major hub situated in Ogden, Utah. Suddenly, society had found the little town, and the flow of goods and information went from a trickle to a flood. From here, a stream of varied firearms went through the Browning shop, allowing the brothers to see just about everything there was in the modern market. Working to repair these varied parts allowed John Moses to pile up a great mental inventory of mechanical interactions. By age 15, John Moses had acquired roughly an 8th grade education, which was the best Ogden could provide him at that particular time. Even so, in 1878, at 23 years old, he designed what would be his first patented rifle. Loosely based on the Sharp's breech loader, this single-shot falling block metallic cartridge rifle was extremely simple, provided a strong lockup, and was quite rugged. He would file for patent on it the very next year. In 1879, Father Jonathan sold his shop to John Moses and Brother Matt for $500. The real value was in his tools and the location. They would give the shop an overhaul. Spelling aside, it was now downright pleasant. With the business sorted out, John Moses turned to matters of the heart. In April, he married Rachel Teresa Child, daughter of the owner of the dry goods store. Despite being raised a fellow Mormon, she would remain his only wife. This was also about the time he filed for the aforementioned patent. Shortly after, in June, Father Jonathan would pass away at the age of 73, leaving behind 18 surviving children and dang near 100 grandchildren. His estate was inherited by his eldest 2 children, the first of which was a daughter some 28 years older than John Moses, and then her brother that was 2 years younger. Actually, technically, her husband inherited instead of her. Regardless, in the shuffling of papers, they took ownership of the major tools of Father's shop in Ogden. This is despite John Moses and Matt having already seemingly paid for them. They would have to buy it all back for a little over $30 at auction, which soured the boys on their older siblings for the rest of their lives. Even so, the new venture did good business, and by the end of 1879, they had Brother Ed helping with repairs at the shop. They also decided to make the investments necessary to produce their own rifle. In 1880, they invested in a steam engine to power the old lathe and picked up a mill. By hand, they began manufacturing John Moses' patented rifle, making all of the parts and stocks in-house, but ordering the barrels in from back east. Luckily, they made an acquaintance with one Frank Rushton, a former employee of the Birmingham gun makers, who helped them set up the machinery for serial production. John Moses would actually praise Rushton for teaching him the tenets of mass manufacture, allowing him to further improve his future designs by considering how easily they could be made. Together they produced an initial batch of 25 rifles, which were sold at $25 apiece. These actually moved quite quickly, and within 3 months 100 were out the door. That same year, John Moses' first child was born. John Moses Browning Jr., who thankfully would come to be known as Jack, which was far less confusing. The income from the now senior Browning's new rifles, plus selling products shipped in from back east, and of course the repair work, started to accumulate a healthy income for all 3 of the brothers. So they thought to push things further, with John Moses now designing a hand-loading hand tool, filing for a patent in August of 1881. This time, Brother Matthew is listed on the patent as well. This is because in these early days of invention, Matthew both helped him with design and assembly of the prototypes, but also shared in the core business. Now, this patent would actually be sold to Marlin Firearms in 1882. This caused the development of another second pattern of loading tool for their own production. This was not actually patented, likely because it was already covered by patents held by Winchester Repeating Arms. That's actually what I'm showing you now. These date back to 1874, but were updated as recently as 1880. Now, Winchester did not become immediately aware of this issue, so for a few years, the brothers' business carried on as usual. Finally, in March of 1882, John Moses had designed a bolt-action rifle along the lines of the Austrian Kropatschek. While interesting, this design appears to have been somewhat derivative of what was already available in the market, and does not appear to have been sold or manufactured. Following this, he worked up a very strange but extremely simple lever-action repeating rifle, one where the bolt face tips back to face the sky, using a single piece for the lever and bolt body. This rifle too was ultimately unsuccessful, however we will see its core concept return a few more times. Also during 1882, John and Rachel's second child was born, and the next year saw yet another. Sadly, both Austin Leroy and Hugh Harrison would not survive past 1 year's age each. Infant mortality was still quite high in the late 1800s. Now, supposedly, a Winchester salesman spotted the knockoff hand-loading tools in 1883, tattling to the mother company. At the same time, he either sent back an example of the new Browning rifle or perhaps just a drawing. I'm frankly unsure which. Regardless, this invention solved a rather nasty hole that existed in the Winchester product lineup at that time. You see, they were most famed for their lever-action Model 1873 rifle, which was very handy and reliable, but only chambered essentially a pistol cartridge. They attempted to compete in the rifle cartridge market with the Model 1876, but at this time a rifle cartridge was basically 4570 or similar, a big black powder cartridge full of oomph. The nature of the Winchester locking action meant that the rifle had to be quite heavily built to withstand the pressure, making it heavy, awkward, and a slow seller. Browning's patented single shot offered an inexpensive to produce yet very strong and rugged breech. Self-cocking and easy to use, it also opened up with a levering operation, perfect for the company branded on lever guns. Winchester's vice president, who actually ran the company mind you, was Thomas Gray Bennett. His company was, at the time, being pressured from several sides. Competition had emerged from Marlin's competitive lever actions, and there were signs that Colt's patent firearms were moving into the rifle market. In response, Bennett had hired away Colt's excellent engineer, William Mason, and used his revolver expertise to startle Colt out of direct competition with Winchester. Mason was frankly brilliant at refining designs for mass production, but he seems to have lacked the novel approach of John Moses Browning. Bennett apparently asked Mason if he could work around the Browning's patent for their rifle, but the answer came back in the negative, so negotiations were begun. Bennett made a stop in Ogden in December of 1883. The trip wasn't specifically for Browning, but his business was worth a day's effort while he was on his way out west for other matters. The story is most commonly told that Browning asked for $10,000 payment for ownership of the patent, as this was the largest number that he could think of at the time. Bennett countered with $8,000 and the ability to sell the remaining stock of the contraband hand-loading tools and a retroactive right to those sold so far for just $1. Overall, some 500 or so Browning rifles were made in Ogden, following which a modified version was sold by Winchester. This became the Model 1885, initially just known as the Winchester single-shot rifle. It was offered in the same pistol calibers as a low wall and in big boy cartridges as a high wall. Some 44,000 would be produced in the first 5 years. While the single-shot rifle was being tooled up at Winchester, John Moses continued to contemplate the perfected lever-action repeater. Filing in March of 1884, he patented another simple rifle. This was, like the current Winchester, a toggle lock. However, here the link abuts the inside of the frame just in front of the trigger guard, providing more direct support to the bolt. This arrangement, however, was not in a straight line and therefore still somewhat lacking. Filing again in May, he hit on something ingenious. Here, a pair of locking blocks, inspired no doubt by his own single-shot rifle, rise with the closing lever to flank the bolt and rigidly affix it to the receiver walls. A very strong and compact locking arrangement. John and Matt boarded a train and, for the first time in their lives, traveled east into the big cities. Over a series of these trips, the brothers would learn that their inherited Appalachian accent and loose grammar were not inspiring confidence in the field, so they bought a grammar book and began studying up on the matter together on their train rides. This first trip, however, saw them hoping to sell their new rifle to Winchester, while also investigating the tool-up for their single shot. This, too, would be bought outright by Bennett, by the way. It became the Winchester Model 1886, a repeater capable of chambering the big-bore black powder rifle cartridges with ease, making something of an original lever-action express rifle. This product, however, was somewhat pricey, leading to sales of only 40,000 or so in the first 5 years. Considering the profits from selling just 2 rifles to Winchester, the Brownings, of course, turned their attention toward developing further lever-action long arms. Filing in March of 1885, John Moses now worked out a front-locking bolt arrangement which slapped in place like a low 5 over top and into battery. This would not be developed into a product, but the overhand concept does seem to return later. Filing in May, he also worked out an out-of-battery safety which kept the firing pin from falling until the gun was fully locked shut. He also made improvements to ejection and the carrier or cartridge elevator. While it isn't claimed, I will also point out that in this system, he provides a hinge point that allows the lever to distend from the bottom of the action. Some of these elements will appear later on in his work. Both this and the previous patent were purchased by Winchester. Even if they weren't to be produced, they provided a means of preventing competition from elsewhere. Now, by apparent request from Winchester, John Moses turned his attention towards a lever-action operated repeating shotgun. Frankly, a daunting task considering the nature of tube loading and the jumbo-sized 12-gauge cartridges. Filing in June of 1885, we get this, a Titanic receiver to accommodate the rotating breech block and 12-gauge shells. The action doesn't just pivot, but also creeps at the end of the closing stroke, locking a shoulder into the receiver. Filing in January of 1886, Browning further improved the action with a set of pivoting extractors. These patents would become Winchester's model of 1887, a complex machine that netted fewer than 80,000 units of sales over its lifetime. While terrifically interesting, it was hardly practical. Even so, it was adapted to the 10-gauge cartridge, which bought it some additional years of production. Reinforced and upgraded as the Model 1901, which was added to the product line much later to keep a 10-gauge option in hand and make use of existing tooling. Now, on the family side of things, in August of 1885, Louis Browning, the first daughter, was born. She and all subsequent children would survive into adulthood. Now, these patents do not always follow the same order in which John Moses came up with his ideas, I will say. They merely represent when he felt they were far enough along to represent a whole invention. Now, thankfully, at this point, he was selling everything to Winchester to serve as roadblocks, so he seems to have largely filed patents as quickly as he felt that they were ready. All this is to say, there is some evidence that he was considering a pump-action shotgun even before the lever model of 1887. The concept already existed, of course, but wasn't being utilized to its fullest. Browning felt that he could do better. His first attempt was filed for patent at the end of 1885, before the final improvements to the lever shotgun. This hammer-fired slide action used a rotating bolt with a sort of pin as a locking lug. Improvements were filed in May of 1886, such as ejecting from the right instead of overhead. However, neither design was carried forward. Unlike other patents so far, these were not assigned to Winchester right from the start, though I am told they bought them later on, just to be sure. The same was true for his July filing for this pump-action rifle, which is frankly quite lovely, with its breech block tipping back and disappearing into the wrist of the stock in order to feed. I kinda wish this one had gone a little further. Note that the hammer uses a trigger-like spur along the lines of the Spencer shotgun of that era. Filing in September of 1886, Browning presented two firearms this time. One was this tipping block pump-action shotgun, clearly a modification of that said Spencer shotgun, although a much more efficient one that was far easier on the user. This design might have been a calculated defensive maneuver for Winchester, as once more they are listed on the filing. Preventing Spencer from advancing his design was as good as inventing one of their own. The other filing was for an improved single-shot rifle. This essentially borrowed Browning's own pair of locking blocks nested on either side of the breech. Neither of these designs would see commercial production. In early 1887, John Moses was dispatched by the Church of Latter-day Saints to serve as a missionary for the Mormon Church. At this time, they were expected to walk their appointed region, spreading the teachings of the Book of Mormon, all but penniless and with scant possessions, depending on the charity of strangers for food and shelter. As a promising young Mormon, John Moses was given a challenging region to work in, the Deep South. Following the war, Southerners were poor and prideful, especially wary of Yankee profiteers who they saw as feeding on the Reconstruction. These fellows, however, often fared better than the Mormon missionaries. Polygamy was deeply unpopular, and the Southern churches saw the missionaries as a threat at best and more likely sacrilege incarnate. Beatings, jailings, and even tar and feathering, let alone the occasional murder, were not unheard of. While John was away on this supposedly 2-year-long assignment, Matthew ran the shop. Even so, John Moses' life carried on in such a way that suggests he made regular trips back home to Utah. In November, he filed a patent for a... wow. Okay, this is not unlike his first lever-action patent. Now, only just about the whole lockwork is contained within the lever and breech block assembly. This rifle still used a tubular magazine, and I'm saddened to say again, it did not enter production. Filing in December, he now covered a front-locking pump-action rifle, somewhat along the lines of that earlier overhand system we saw. Unlike previous designs, however, this was submitted to Winchester as a paper drawing. Apparently their engineers said it wasn't workable, so the Brownings whipped up a prototype and sent it along with a note from John Moses saying, "It seems to shoot pretty fair to me." This back and forth likely took some time, as the refined action wasn't filed for patent until January of 1890, likely after tooling up had already begun, because this rifle did enter production with Winchester repeating arms, becoming the Winchester Model of 1890, a 22 caliber rimfire repeater of great popularity, both with direct consumers and with fun parks and fairs as a gallery gun. This led to sales of some 2.1 million units, and left it in production in one form or another into the 1980s. Curiously, what appears to be the patent covering the 1890s magazine tube was filed much later, in August of 1892. Perhaps an oversight, or I'm missing some critical detail. In December of 1887, another daughter was born, Carrie Browning, so again we know that John Moses made at least one trip back home. By the middle of 1888, 2 more patents were filed, this time for a pair of pump-action shotguns. The first features a unique laterally pivoting breech block, that means flapping side to side to lock and unlock. The other method was to use a set of locking lugs, one front and one near the middle of the breech block. This bolt simply tipped down and exited the rear of the receiver. Both were purchased by Winchester, but neither were produced. Wrapping up his missionary work in 1889, John Moses was able to, once again, work from his own shop, with his own brothers on the regular. With John Moses on hand, Matthew Browning became more involved in the business aspect of their lives, making various investments and even venturing into local politics. Over time, he became less and less involved with the actual process of invention and prototyping. John Moses kept on, however, with brother Ed, who frankly became an excellent machinist and parts maker. The two brothers would, over time, become extremely close in their work, with John Moses conjuring ideas from his mind and Jonathan Edmond converting a mix of quick sketches and verbal descriptions into hard metal. Shotgun fever continued with a June 1889 filing for a tilting block overhead rocking design, this time locking up at the rear where the breech block abuts the frame. A sort of 180-degree rotation of what would be the 1890 pump rifle. Filing in November, we see what might just be my favorite unrealized Browning invention. If I could afford to bring just one of these discards to life, this is it. Another capsule-style lever action where the bolt face rocks back to vertical. However, now even the ammunition is carried along with the lever, which means that at rest, all the rounds point towards the ground. An interesting way to avoid having inertia pull out your bullets. What I somehow find even more entertaining is the need for a spring-loaded dust cover of sorts at the bottom front of the receiver. I'm frankly surprised Winchester paid for this. Now about this time, several things start happening all at once. It would be difficult to express each step in the process, especially because our patent filings are not a perfect indicator of when he thought of what, so I'm going to do my best to sort of bundle these overlaid concepts together. I suppose most importantly for the long run was that Browning started cooking with gas. Back in October of 1889, he had taken note of the clover covering the ground at the shooting range. It was being blown all to heck by each shot of the shooting club's members' rifles. Realizing the wasted energy potential, he ran home with his brothers. There, he wired down an old Winchester 44 and drilled a hole through a block of wood, placed it right in front of the rifle, and shot straight through said hole. Despite the bullet making no direct contact with the block, it was, of course, blown away violently. This was something new that he could work with. Filing in January of 1890, we can see he was eager to get the concept all tied up, regardless of any refinement. Here we have a lever-action rifle fitted with a ping-pong paddle-like flipper with a hole through the center. This is in essence a gas trap, meant to make use of the existing gas expansion that wasn't used up by propelling our bullet. By the time this was filed, however, he was already on to better things. In December, he was already firing some 15 shots with one pull of the trigger, and the struggle had become to feed the rounds fast enough to keep up with the action. Winchester, however, was not interested in his work on this front, so he had to find another buyer. While that was going on, in February of 1890, daughter Elsie was born. But back to business. Knowing that the manually cranked Gatling gun had been produced at Colt Patent Firearms, he knew he had a potential client and soon ventured forth. Browning took with him a sort of infernal device, a strange, almost skeletonized version of what would become a true machine gun. As was, Browning had not bothered with anything unnecessary, as this was really just a proof of concept, so there was no need to seal it up. Though filed much later in August of 1891, this patent is probably the closest thing to what he had in hand at the time. A 40-pound rapid-fire gun chambering the 4570 government cartridge, capable of expending them at 360 rounds a minute. In December of 1890, he took the time to visit both Winchester, for a matter that we'll cover in a moment, and Colt. There he displayed this jumble of metal along with 4 canvas belts of ammunition, each carrying 50 rounds. In just about 1 minute of demonstration, he had expended 200 rounds so fast, no one would believe what they saw as smoke filled Colt's factory. Shortly after, it was again demonstrated for officers of the US Navy, who were also stunned and enthused when 1,800 cartridges were expended without a single failure of the prototype system. At this point, however, the government wasn't spending money, and the gun wasn't ready for service anyway. Browning still had to solve the problem of rapid overheating of the barrel. Colt offered a contract for the invention, but at this point he declined for want of doing better. It's worth pointing out that this was still a flapper system. A filing from the same time as this patent reveals a cumbersome but tellingly clever solution to the back and forth shaking of the flapper. Here, a sort of machine gun pinwheel is spun up by the bursts of each shot. Okay, this might be my second most desired invention to see actually produced. Now, rewinding a bit, Browning was not just working on a machine gun. At the same time, he still had been picking at the question of a pump-action shotgun. Filing in June of 1890, both Browning and Winchester were finally committing to a design. This slide action used a unique hinged hook to hold and release the action bar. The breech block itself ran in a linear track, popping from the rear of the action when open. However, the locking block was tipping, also serving as the cartridge elevator. It seems Browning's meeting with Winchester just before the demonstration of his machine gun at Colt's was to discuss this shotgun. It would take a few years to perfect and put into production, ultimately becoming the Winchester 1893, which was actually quite the market failure. Though that wasn't entirely the fault of the gun's design. Instead, its rapid slam-fire operation combined with early smokeless powders, being hygroscopic, resulted in out-of-battery detonations for consumers. The manual of arms was also apparently counterintuitive, so changes would have to be made later on. Looking at patent dates alone, a gap opens up during 1891. This is likely because of a challenge issued by Winchester's VP. In that same 1890 meeting, he apparently offered a bounty for quickly designing a replacement for Winchester's Model 1873 lever gun. The original pistol caliber carbine was starting to slump on sales. Browning was asked to replace it in just 3 months. If successful, he'd be paid $10,000. If he could do it in 2 months, it became $15,000. Browning countered that he'd have it done in just 30 days for $20,000, or he'd give the design to Winchester. A contract was drawn, though the gratis part was left out, and within the month, the prototype was in Winchester's hands. It was built on the same patent as the earlier 1886, now shrunk down and tidied up a bit. The final necessary changes for feeding were filed in September of 1892, curiously after the rifle had started sales to the public. This, of course, became the model of 1892, an instant classic. Because of its limited role in the Great War, we actually already have a video dedicated to the history of this rifle, so give it a shot if you'd like to learn more. 2 patents filed in August of 1891 thankfully brought back more of that never actually made insanity that I happen to love. One was a lever-action rifle based on the 1886. It was now striker-fired and featured a vertical box magazine. Keeping the relationship of parts in the lockwork the same meant that the magazine had to feed just about where a tubular magazine did. So, in this system, the rounds are plucked rearward from the underside box. This was, of course, never developed for sale. Even more interesting was the same-day filing of what I can only call an accordion action. Here, the receiver is in 2 pieces, and pumping the whole front of the rifle away from the buttstock portion of the rifle essentially opens the gun up, allowing room for the feeding of cartridges before you press the whole thing back together. This system was very efficient on space, as the receiver didn't need to accommodate for the negative travel space required to feed ammunition. It was, however, fairly complex and likely to allow the ingress of foreign materials into the lockwork while you were working the action back and forth. It was never developed into a product as far as I know. Filing in March of 1892, the same concept was now applied to a repeating shotgun, and of course with some improvements. I really wish just one of these had been actually tried in the market. That same month saw a filing for this, another lever action, but using a vertical N-block magazine. Filed at the same time was, of course, a patent for the clip, which strangely was awarded sometime later than the rifle itself. Stranger still, a June filing on an improved version of the same N-block rifle concept was actually accepted before the initial patent was accepted. This svelte-looking design also puts the breech block into the wrist instead of having it project out from the top of the receiver. This is also his first design to feature a lever-locking latch affixed to the frame of the gun. Still in June of 1892, the end-block concept would be fitted to Browning's accordion series of pull-apart rifles and shotguns. This design must have held his attention because it was updated further in September of 1892. Or at least it was filed at the same time as the changes that marked the 1892 Winchester rifle. This patent really covers a simplification of the magazine retention and the sear. Skipping ahead just a bit, in October of 1892, Browning filed for another end-block clip rifle. This time it's a sort of lever action with the trigger guard serving as said lever. The entire underside of the action is allowed to open up during operation, with a fair bit of linkage dropping into the open air. The bolt retracts along the top of the wrist. Okay, now rewinding just a bit, June of 1892 also included the birth of daughter Monida. In July, we get a glimpse of his ongoing work to adapt his gas operation into a shoulder arm, this time a self-pumping rifle using a pair of gas-activated levers. While clearly somewhat rudimentary, this design does make use of lateral ports, though at the time it was done just to balance the forces of the levers against each other. Even so, we're no longer just cupping the muzzle. From here, John Moses seems to walk back just a bit, filing 2 patents for greatly simplified basic rifles. One, filed in December of 1892, was a remarkably plain single-shot breech-loading .22, which used the breech block for ignition, and as the trigger itself. Sublime, if a bit sketchy. Filing in March of 1893, another single-shot, though somewhat more complex. This lovely design used the trigger guard as the falling breech block. Now, once again, we start to have a couple of projects overlapping, so please forgive, again, a little back and forth, which is frankly further confused by the various filings and apparently their updated appeals. The next machine gun patent was filed in November of 1892, however, its final form references a later filing. Broadly, both patents are gas-operated, fully automatic lock-breech machine guns, feeding from a fabric belt of ammunition. Gas pressure is communicated by a swinging underside lever ahead of the magazine. In this design, the breech block is cammed laterally to lock and unlock. Filing in March of 1893, we get a toggle-ish lock version of the same general machine gun, though of course other small changes are noted. Following on in June, we get a tipping bolt version which locks into the top of the receiver, much like the much older shotgun patent. Filed in September of 1893, we finally get a familiar sight, a tipping block design where the rear corner is dropped into an abutment in the frame in order to lock the action. Gas pressure drives the lever, and in clockwork fashion, the rear of the bolt is raised, allowing it to travel rearward. This patent is the closest to the production model that would emerge. John Moses Browning brought his improved machine gun to Colt's Patent Firearms in the winter of 1893. This compact tripod-mounted automatic was a hit with the factory and management, so a contract was signed in February. Instead of straight cash, however, he received a royalty agreement, meaning a sum for each gun produced by Colts. Sadly, while under patent, the resulting Colt model of 1895 was a slow seller, making this a less profitable venture than it should have been, especially given the ingenuity involved. This same trip, by the way, saw John Moses making a new and eventually quite helpful friend. Hart Ostomer Berg, an American-born multilingual world traveler, then 38 years old and working at Colt's Patent Firearms. Hart had been an engineering student in Liège during the 1880s and now worked alongside Browning as the Colt 1895 machine gun took shape. The short, energetic, and openly friendly Berg was almost the opposite of the tall, quiet, and reserved Browning. But they apparently hit it off quite well, because we'll see Berg later on in our story. Now, just to round out the automatic conversation, in December of 1894, a patent was filed for this top-feeding automatic rifle, clearly another modified lever action. Frankly, from descriptions at the time, I suspect this design dates from much earlier in the Browning machine gun's evolution, but was likely filed to lock in some core considerations just in case they were needed. And just because we're on the topic, here's a filing from April of 1895, a simple channel between the buffer area of the receiver and the chamber. The hope was to create a sort of automatic blow tube, which would help clear fouling from the barrel as the gun operated. I'm not aware of it being used in any of the production guns, though. Changing tracks back at Winchester Repeating Arms, that Model 1892 proved to be an instant hit. The size and balance were splendid, and the lever throw was just right. Only problem was the cartridge was just too mild to be an all-around North American game rifle. Winchester asked Browning to turn his attention towards making a more powerful version of the same rifle, and thankfully, as we've seen from earlier patents, he had some options to keep it tight. Filing in January of 1894, though I'm sure the gun was developed well before, we see a lever action like the 1892, but with a key difference. The bottom distends from the action, allowing for more throw on the bolt and thereby a longer cartridge, while also keeping the receiver shape and the lever sweep the same as the previous 1892. This, of course, became the Winchester Model of 1894. A smashing success with over 6.5 million produced into the year 2000. The rifle's most popular chambering was actually added after it had already hit the market, the .30 Winchester centerfire, or the 30-30. For most Americans, this was their first experience with a smokeless cartridge, which further impressed the image of the 1894 in our collective consciousness. This rifle even saw limited service during the Great War, so we do have a full episode on it that you can enjoy. While he was back on lever actions, John Moses also apparently revisited his idea for a vertical magazine option. Filing in November of 1894, this large-framed rifle could handle the emerging full-size smokeless small-bore service cartridges of the time. It used a single-stack vertical magazine which fed from overhead. The lockwork is somewhat modified but still reminiscent of the prior Model 1894. This patent became the Winchester Model of 1895. Though not as popular as its older brother, it did carve out a niche as a favorite of game hunters like Theodore Roosevelt. During the Great War, the rifle was also militarized. Well, the existing militarized version finally saw significant sales. But you can learn all about that in our episode on the 1895. Now, it was only during World War I that the 1895 gained a rapid loading option from the factory. However, it seems that John Moses might have considered a solution all the way back at the time of invention. Filing in July of 1895, we get this charger packet. Much like the Swiss cardboard version, this little envelope would hold your cartridges until you thumb the lot into the magazine of the rifle. If that's not to your liking, try this April of 1895 filing for a tubular magazine variation of the Winchester 1895. Mostly. This one also did not see production and may have just been more blocking by Winchester. Now with that little track rundown, let's take a quarter step back. Filing at the same time as what would become the 1895, we see another pump-action shotgun is on Browning's mind. This time it used a laterally tilting locking bolt, not unlike one of the machine gun patents we saw earlier. This design may have been his attempt to expand that same concept, as much as possible for protection in the market. That premise is somewhat supported by an April of 1895 filing. The same locking action was paired with what I'd best call a pump-action model of 1895. Man, even Browning's offcuts are cool. Now, at about this time, the problems with that old model of 1893 pump-action shotgun were starting to boil over. Winchester wanted a fix, and in his way, Browning attempted to provide one. Filing in April of 1895, John Moses whipped up this. From the outside, it might look familiar, but the internals are... okay, actually, they're very familiar for different reasons entirely. Here we have a series of lugs on the top of the breech block which meet matching grooves in the top of the receiver. The rise and fall of the block is accomplished with a set of swinging links. Filing in March of 1896, another squared-off shotgun was attempted. This time with a locking bolt hinged into the breech block, which pops up into a recess in the frame. This sort of reminds me of an upside-down Mannlicher 1886. Critically, this patent's most important feature is a system to prevent the breech from being opened should a user pump backwards before the cartridge is ignited and the gun recoils. While not exactly what Winchester adopts later on, it is along the lines of something they will later implement. This shotgun also features a takedown method for the barrel and magazine. Now, in the time between the filing of those previous two patents, particularly August of 1895, Browning's fourth son, but only the second that would survive until adulthood, was born, Val Allen Browning. Now, just in case anyone is curious, John Moses Browning never did fix the Winchester 1893. His offer of other designs didn't make enough use of existing tooling, and given the sales of the gun so far, Winchester wasn't in the mood for a whole other model. They eventually worked out a modification that resolved the major issues with the 93, re-releasing it as the Model 1897, a gun often credited to Browning, and yeah, the core lockwork is his, but much of the interface is not. Okay, shotgun run is wrapped for a moment, but let's keep with the year 1895, because while he was working on his gas system machine gun and machine rifle, Browning also started to consider a gas-operated pistol. Filing in September of 1895, this lock breech handgun blasts its overhead lever up before it springs back down in order to work the breech. While functional, it sort of set people on edge. Ultimately, the gas operation as a whole was abandoned. However, the lockwork for the hammer, sear, and detachable magazine retention, plus the wraparound transfer bar for the trigger, would carry forward. Also, if you take a look at the breech block, which moved in a linear fashion while taking up the majority of the upper and rear of the pistol, you'll get a glimpse at the modern slide. This feature would actually become more apparent in Browning's next 3 handgun patents, which were all filed at once in October of 1896, meaning we're not sure which idea came first or last, so we'll just go in our own order. The first we'll cover is the most alien to us today, and yet at the time was probably the most familiar. Here we have a very plain-looking tubular gun. The cocking piece is nested inside the frame. The breech block is locked by rotating locking lugs. It's striker fired, and the recoil spring is wrapped around the barrel itself to keep things compact. While there are some great features here that we'll see again later, this pistol was never produced for commercial sale. Next up was something simpler in operation but more complex in appearance. The first slide-operated handgun with the barrel shroud and breech block integrated as one unit. The breech is unlocked, which limited the power of a potential cartridge, just the overall mass of the block and the power of the overhead recoil spring to keep things shut long enough for gas pressure to drop. Much of this patent would later be refined into a workable design, but we'll get there in a moment. The third patent borrowed from his previous shotgun, actually, using a pair of links now mated to the barrel instead of the breech block. These cammed said barrel into the underside of the reciprocating slide, which also is the breech block, in order to lock or unlock the pistol. The recoil spring was set below the barrel. All 3 pistols were showed to Colt's Patent Firearms even before the patents were filed. They were only interested in the 2 locking designs, with only this variation being put into various trials and eventually production. The result would be the Colt model of 1900, which wasn't terribly successful but did manage to pave the way for later designs. This is, thankfully, another Browning invention that we have covered before, so you can learn about it in detail if you would like. While his little blowback pistol was snubbed by Colt's Patent Firearms, John Moses Browning felt it was amongst his favorite inventions. Developed alongside a .32 caliber cartridge, he kept it in his jacket pocket and often shot it when outdoors, if only someone was interested. Well, actually, friend Hart Berg had left Colt's for a Belgian firm known as Fabrique Nationale. This was a company born of a Liège consortium in order to fulfill government orders for the Mauser 1889 rifle. Unfortunately, FN flew a bit too close to the sun that was Mauser's intellectual property rights, and started angling to sell more modern versions to foreign governments. A legal battle ensued where FN lost and suffered financial catastrophe. Mauser's parent company, then Ludwig Loewe, bought up the stock, effecting a hostile takeover. Their combined arms production holdings were then reformed under the banner of DWM. All this is to say, FN was under the control of the Germans, and were being kept near idle to just serve the Belgian government contracts. Berg and others began looking for products that they could sell that wouldn't earn the ire of their parent company. Among these were consumer goods, like bicycles, but they were also interested in sporting arms and pistols. So Berg kept reaching out to the best inventor that he knew personally. In March of 1897, John Moses Browning made his first transatlantic voyage, traveling through France and eventually arriving in Liège. There he was greeted warmly, and displaying all of his pistols, the unwanted pocket model drew the most attention this time. It fired some 500 rounds without a single failure. The FN management was enthused, but still needed DWM's approval, so Browning was sent to Berlin to again display his wares, now in front of both DWM executives and Hugo Borchardt, inventor of the then market-leading locked breech handgun, the Borchardt C93. This cumbersome pistol did at least present a powerful enough cartridge to be of martial consideration. Browning's little .32 blowback wasn't seen as occupying the same market. So the project was greenlit, and a contract was signed in July after Browning had already returned home. Filing in December of 1897, he now protected what had likely already been shown, for the most part, in Belgium. A slide-operated blowback pistol with an overhead recoil spring, manual safety, striker-fired, extremely compact, and very reliable. Both the pistol and the contract proved to be very important for Browning's future. There was an initial payment of 2,000 Belgian franc, with a royalty payment of 2 francs per pistol sold. If fewer than 5,000 were to be produced, then the patent reverts to Browning. This was likely a lesson learned from Colts, but it was ultimately unnecessary. Most importantly, however, Browning's name was to feature prominently on the little automatic. The result was Le Pistolet Browning, which would later take on the collector's appellation FN 1899. This pocket 32 entered the market in 1899, with sales being actually just okay at first. We'll check back in on that a little bit later, because, once more, we have to rewind and check in on some other patents. I also want to point out Browning never knew for sure what would be a winner when he wrote it down, so he just kept inventing and iterating on those core concepts until something finally stuck. These early failures were, at the time of their creation, potential successes. Filing in May of 1897, we have another lever-action vertical magazine rifle. This time seemingly borrowing from the 1887 shotgun and one of the earlier designs where the bolt would disappear into the wrist. To my eye, it's a bit bulky. In February of 1898, another magazine rifle, this time with a sort of overhand rocking lever action. Again, a design that saw no further development than to sit in Winchester's arsenal of "you can't do that." In August of 1898, the Brownings got to welcome son Kenneth Sandifer Browning. Now, about this time, there does seem to be a bit of a gap in the patent grind. Perhaps those new pistols from Colt and FN were keeping him busy. In February of 1899, however, we do see a winner. A very simple single-shot small-bore bolt-action rifle. This tidy arrangement did see production at Winchester, almost exactly as displayed here, becoming what we know as the Model 1900. The Model 1902 introduced a curly trigger guard, and in 1904 it got a heavier barrel option, but what's most remarkable was a non-Browning modification. The Winchester Thumb Trigger 22, so you can get your trigger guard in plain, fancy, or non-existent. Next up is one of John Moses' stranger patents, not just for the action, but because of the extreme time it would take to see it accepted. Filing in May of 1899, this semi-automatic shotgun application wouldn't be accepted until June of 1903. What's here in the patent is a toggle-locking auto-loading shotgun which feeds from a tubular magazine. According to later testimony, this was loosely sketched out by John Moses Browning back in 1894 or 1895. However, he returned to the concept late in the year 1897. Now, that's the story according to the Browning brothers. In 1897, however, John Moses had visited DWM, so it's possible he was inspired by the C93 bore-shot pistol to either create or revisit his toggle lock idea. Regardless, it seems a rough prototype was completed by brother Ed before another trip to Liège in 1898, this time to help tool up that FN 1899 pistol production. While John Moses was away, the project sat idle. Late in 1898, however, they began testing and modifying the prototype. They believed they had the kinks worked out and put it on display during a public shooting match. However, it then failed to run properly. 2 additional prototypes were assembled with various changes. John Moses believed this gun was amongst his best ideas to date, and that it would prove to be a great commercial success. Winchester, however, wasn't as interested, and this was for several fairly good reasons. The most quoted is that Browning now demanded a royalty payment instead of the usual lump sum, and that is true, but unlike most stories claim, Winchester's VP actually acquiesced. As much as he resented being so dependent on Browning, he also did not want to lose the golden goose. However, at this point in time, Bennett did believe Browning had brought him some rotten eggs. That pump-action shotgun, the Winchester 1893, had been a dud and a bit of a customer confidence nightmare. Winchester's own engineers had just fixed the problem in 1897 and were frankly still making a myriad of tweaks to keep the model on the right track. Now, here's Browning wanting more money and guaranteed production of another shotgun, one that would cannibalize the just now stabilized product that cost him so much money to produce. But what could he do? Well, the best is, for Bennett anyway, to stall. So in May of 1899, a contract was signed for the unloved toggle shotgun. This included a little note that the toggle was somewhat similar to the existing Borchardt C93, Winchester wanted to be assured that there was no conflict here. Fun fact, there will be a conflict, but not with Borchardt. Unfortunately, however, that's a story for part 2 of our series. Ladies and gentlemen, it took a triumphant effort to get all this into one set for you, and we will continue that work next time. However, I beg your patience because we want to do it right. If you'd like to support the show, please do stop on by Patreon or Player. That's where 98% of our funds come from. Additional help for this specific episode, though, was made possible by our executive producer, The House of Browning. This is a project and site that is curated by a very friendly gentleman who has helped me clean up some frayed ends on this very episode. He is currently working to document as much of the Browning life as you can imagine, and so it's worth a visit. And if you're looking for something else to watch right now, well, congratulations. We have a whole bunch of links for other Browning-related episodes in our description. You can enjoy much, but not quite all of this inventor's great work. I suppose we're going to need some years to come to finish everything. All right, thank you for joining us, and have a good one.
I'm walking past a parked car when all of a sudden I see and hear it at exactly the same time, loud, aggressive barking and something white and brown dashing at me.
Right.
And at that point, it's like maybe gotten into within a foot of me that quickly. And I went, oh shit, and backed up real quick, and it's a pit bull.
Yeah, so May leaps back, big pit bull. Yeah, no, I got the threatening email.
Oh, okay, you got the threatening email.
Yeah, so the threatening email was, you're going to look bad if you do this, blah, blah, blah. Not an apology or we'll remove it or anything like that. By the way, at this point, they haven't offered to remove any of the offending material.
No.
All of these emails are saying, retract your claim.
Retract your claim? Stop being selfish, retract your claim.
Yeah, stop being you're a selfish dick and you're not helping the community. Retract your claim. None of it's saying, I'm going to stop using your material. It hasn't come out yet.
No.
I don't think you understand. It lunged and snaps at her, and there's children in this neighborhood. If you're not taking care of it, I can take care of it. And he decides I'm being rude to him, so he gets kind of this, it happens very quickly, but he gets this look on his face like, oh, now are we fighting now? And I just look down, pointedly look down at the passenger seat that he hasn't looked at. And he looks down and he sees the 12 gauge and he goes, oh shit. Hi, I'm Matthias, and this is the Colt's patent firearms automatic pistol model of 1911, perhaps the most iconic handgun across the world. Copied, tweaked, and polished for over 100 years, it's still a common sight at ranges today. For this episode, though, we're covering